Exploring the top 10 most dangerous countries for tourists involves delving into geopolitical instability, civil unrest, high crime rates, terrorism, and other factors that contribute to their perilous status. Each of these nations presents unique challenges and risks for travelers, ranging from ongoing armed conflicts to severe economic crises. Let's examine each country in detail. 1. Syria. Reasons for danger. Syria has been engulfed in a devastating civil war since 2011, resulting in widespread violence, destruction of infrastructure, and a humanitarian crisis. The conflict began as part of the Arab Spring uprising but quickly escalated into a complex war involving multiple factions, including government forces, rebel groups, jihadist organizations, and Kurdish militias. Specific risks for tourists. Civil war and conflict zones. Large parts of Syria are active conflict zones with frequent bombings, artillery shelling, and ground fighting. Terrorism. The presence of extremist groups such as ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, pose significant risks, including kidnappings and targeted attacks on foreigners. Kidnappings. Foreign nationals are often targeted for ransom by various armed groups operating in the country. Lack of infrastructure. Basic services such as healthcare, electricity, and sanitation are severely disrupted or unavailable in many areas. Despite efforts to restore stability, Syria remains one of the most dangerous places in the world for tourists due to ongoing conflict and the unpredictable nature of the war. 2. Afghanistan. Reasons for danger. Afghanistan has been plagued by decades of conflict, starting with the Soviet invasion in 1979 and followed by civil war, Taliban rule, and the US-led invasion in 2001. The country continues to face insurgency and political instability. Specific risks for tourists. Insurgency and terrorism. Taliban insurgents and other militant groups carry out frequent attacks targeting government institutions, foreign embassies, and public places. Kidnappings. Foreigners, including aid workers and journalists, are at risk of kidnapping by extremist groups seeking ransom or political leverage. Crime. High crime rates in major cities, including armed robbery and petty theft, pose additional risks to tourists. Political instability. The country's political situation remains precarious, with ongoing peace negotiations and concerns about governance and security post-withdrawal of foreign troops. Travel advisories from many governments strongly advise against all travel to Afghanistan due to the high threat of terrorism, kidnapping, and insurgency. 3. Yemen. Reasons for danger. Yemen has been embroiled in a devastating civil war since 2014, exacerbated by regional power struggles and foreign military intervention led by Saudi Arabia. Specific risks for tourists. Civil war and violence. Ongoing conflict between Houthi rebels and the internationally recognized government, along with airstrikes and ground fighting, have caused widespread casualties and humanitarian suffering. Terrorism. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, and ISIS Yemen operate in the country, posing threats to foreigners and local populations alike. Kidnappings. Foreigners, including aid workers and journalists, are at risk of abduction by various armed groups. Lack of infrastructure. Yemen faces severe shortages of food, medicine, and fuel, exacerbated by blockades and restrictions on humanitarian aid. The security situation in Yemen remains extremely volatile, making it one of the most dangerous countries in the world for tourists and travelers. 4. Venezuela. Reasons for danger. Venezuela is experiencing a deep economic and political crisis, leading to social unrest, hyperinflation, and shortages of essential goods and services. Specific risks for tourists. Crime. Venezuela has one of the highest homicide rates in the world, with violent crime including armed robbery, carjacking, and express kidnappings. Political unrest. Protests and demonstrations against the government can turn violent, with security forces sometimes using excessive force. Economic instability. Shortages of food, medicine, and other basic necessities have led to a humanitarian crisis, affecting local residents and tourists alike. Infrastructure challenges. Public services such as healthcare and transportation are severely strained, impacting tourists' ability to access emergency services. Due to these factors, Venezuela is considered a dangerous destination for tourists, and travel advisories warn against non-essential travel to the country. 5. South Sudan. Reasons for danger. South Sudan gained independence from Sudan in 2011 but has since been marred by civil war, ethnic violence, and political instability. Specific risks for tourists. Civil conflict. Ongoing conflict between government forces and rebel groups has resulted in widespread displacement, humanitarian crises, and human rights abuses. Violence. Ethnic tensions often escalate into violence, with civilians, including foreigners, becoming targets. Crime. High levels of crime, including armed robbery and carjacking, pose additional risks to tourists. Lack of infrastructure, limited healthcare facilities, poor road conditions, and inadequate telecommunications make travel and emergency assistance challenging. The security situation in South Sudan remains volatile, with travel advisories warning against all travel to the country due to the high risk of violence and political instability. 6. Somalia. Reasons for danger. Somalia has faced decades of conflict, political instability, and lawlessness, exacerbated by the presence of extremist groups like Al-Shabaab. Specific risks for tourists. Conflict and terrorism. Al-Shabaab carries out frequent attacks, including bombings, shootings, and kidnappings, targeting government institutions, hotels, and public spaces. Piracy. Off the coast of Somalia, piracy remains a significant threat to commercial vessels and occasionally to tourists in the region. Kidnappings. Foreigners, including aid workers, journalists, and tourists, are at risk of abduction for ransom or political purposes. Lack of governance. Somalia lacks effective central governance, with regional administrations and clan militias controlling various parts of the country. Travel to Somalia is strongly discouraged due to the high risk of terrorism, violence, and piracy in the region. 7. Libya. Reasons for danger. Libya has been in turmoil since the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, with ongoing conflict, political fragmentation, and the presence of armed groups. Specific risks for tourists. Political instability. Libya remains divided between rival governments and armed factions, leading to frequent clashes and violence. Terrorism. ISIS and other extremist groups operate in parts of Libya, carrying out attacks against government forces, foreigners, and civilian targets. Crime. High levels of crime, including armed robbery and kidnapping for ransom, pose additional risks to tourists. Infrastructure challenges. Basic services such as healthcare and electricity are often unreliable or unavailable in many areas. Due to these risks, Libya is considered unsafe for tourists, with travel advisories warning against all travel to the country. 8. Central African Republic, CAR. Reasons for danger. The Central African Republic has experienced ongoing conflict, ethnic violence, and political instability, exacerbated by the presence of armed groups. Specific risks for tourists. Conflict and violence. Armed groups, including rebel factions and criminal gangs, operate in various parts of the country, leading to insecurity and violence. Ethnic tensions. Intercommunal violence between different ethnic groups has resulted in atrocities and displacement of civilians. Crime. High rates of crime, including armed robbery and carjacking, pose risks to tourists and residents alike. Lack of infrastructure. Limited access to healthcare, transportation, and other basic services complicates travel and emergency assistance. Travel advisories advise against non-essential travel to the Central African Republic due to the high risk of violence and instability. 9. Iraq. Reasons for danger. Iraq has faced decades of conflict, including the US-led invasion in 2003, insurgency, sectarian violence, and the rise of ISIS. Specific risks for tourists. Terrorism. ISIS and other extremist groups carry out frequent attacks targeting government institutions, security forces, and civilian populations. Kidnappings. Foreigners, including aid workers, journalists, and tourists, have been targeted for abduction by various armed groups. Political instability. Iraq's political situation remains fragile, with ongoing security challenges and governance issues. Crime. High levels of crime, including armed robbery and kidnapping, pose additional risks to tourists. Travel advisories strongly advise against all travel to Iraq due to the high risk of terrorism, kidnapping, and violence. 10. Mali. Reasons for danger. Mali has faced instability since a military coup in 2012, followed by a separatist insurgency and the presence of jihadist groups in the northern regions. Specific risks for tourists. Insurgency and terrorism. Jihadist groups, including affiliates of Al-Qaeda, operate in northern Mali, carrying out attacks against government forces, international peacekeepers, and civilians. Kidnappings. Foreign nationals, including tourists, are at risk of abduction by extremist groups for ransom or political purposes. Crime. High crime rates, including armed robbery and banditry, pose additional risks to travelers. Political instability. Mali's political situation remains fragile, with ongoing challenges in achieving stability and reconciliation between various factions. Travel advisories caution against non-essential travel to Mali due to the high risk of terrorism, kidnapping, and violent crime. In conclusion, these countries are among the most dangerous destinations for tourists due to a combination of ongoing conflict, political instability, high crime rates, terrorism, and inadequate infrastructure. Travel to these regions should be approached with extreme caution, and travelers should stay informed about the latest security developments and adhere to travel advisories issued by their respective governments. See you next destination.